continuing our study of how Jesus fulfills the biblical feasts in remarkable detail. And I want to spend some more time on the topic of Passover in particular. And one detail of that Feast of Passover is what takes place on the 10th of Nisan, 4 days before the actual Passover itself. And I want to go in a slightly different direction than we've looked at before. I want us to look at a prophecy in the book of Daniel. And you'll see as we get to the end of it how remarkably interlinked it is with Passover. So look in Daniel chapter 9, and we're going to look at a prophecy that perhaps we're familiar with. It's referred to as often referred to as Daniel's 70 weeks. So I'm reading from Daniel 9 and starting in verse 24. 70 weeks have been decreed for your people and your holy city, to finish the transgression, to make an end of sin, to make atonement for iniquity, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal up vision and prophecy, and to anoint the most holy place. So you are to know and discern that from the issuing of a decree to restore and rebuild Jerusalem until Messiah the Prince, there will be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. It will be built again with plaza and moat, even in times of distress. Then after the 62 weeks, the Messiah will be cut off and have nothing, and the people of the Prince who is to come, that is another prince, will destroy the city and the sanctuary, and its end will come with a flood. Even to the end there will be war. Desolations are determined. And just one more verse 27, and he will make a firm covenant with the many for 1 week, but in the middle of the week he will put a stop to sacrifice and grain offering, and on the wing of abominations will come one who makes desolate, even until a complete destruction, one that is decreed, is poured out on the one who makes desolate. It's an interesting prophecy. God specifically talks about 70 weeks, and then he breaks it down. He says 7 weeks and 62 weeks, which is 69 of the 70 weeks. After that, there will be an end to sacrifice. And this is speaking specifically of Messiah coming, being crucified, and breaking the power of sin once and for all, making the one sacrifice of his own life on the cross to deal with sin for all time, and to bring in righteousness and everlasting righteousness, to introduce us to everlasting life. And so this prophecy is very interesting because it speaks that this 69-week period that leads up to this ending of sin. And then there's one more week that will follow. And that week that follows, we have still yet to experience. And I'll talk about that more later. But this 69 weeks is a very specific period of time. And it is marked, according to this prophecy, by the issuing of a decree to restore and rebuild Jerusalem until Messiah the Prince. There will be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. So this is predicting Jesus coming to bring an end to sin by the sacrifice of himself on the cross, by his death, and by his resurrection bringing new life to us who believe in his name. However, the starting of the stopwatch until that comes, remember this was hundreds of years before Jesus comes on the scene. And so what is it that begins this stopwatch of 69 weeks? Well, it begins with a decree, a royal decree to restore and rebuild Jerusalem. That's what this particular prophecy is requiring as the beginning of this 69-week period, the initiating of the 69 weeks. Well, there are several decrees. If you look through the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, you'll find that there are actually 4 royal decrees that are made regarding Jerusalem. But I would suggest to you that the first 3 out of the 4, are not focused on restoring and rebuilding Jerusalem, but they are focused on restoring and rebuilding the temple. The first year of Darius, at the beginning of Ezra, in fact, the entire first chapter of the book of Ezra defines a decree made by Cyrus. Remember, Cyrus had been prophesied by Isaiah that God would raise up a pagan king, if you will, a heathen king named Cyrus, who would be involved in rebuilding the temple. And that prophecy came at least 150 or more years before Cyrus was even born. Cyrus was the Medo-Persian king, and he came as the first king after the Babylonian Empire came to an end. And Daniel was there at that time in Babylon when the Babylonian Empire ended. Remember Belshazzar, the grandson of Nebuchadnezzar, who was profoundly disrespectful of the God of Israel and the Jewish people, did not know Daniel, did not respect Daniel's counsel as his predecessors had done. And he gets all of the furnishings out of that came from the temple in Jerusalem, and he has this huge party, and they're eating and drinking and praising the gods of gold and silver, and they're drinking out of the holy items that were used in the temple. And if you recall, a hand appears before Belshazzar and writes on the wall, Mene, Mene, Tekel Upharsin. It's a judgment. And he is terrified. Belshazzar is terrified, but he doesn't know what it means. He eventually, by a counsel given to him, he calls Daniel, and Daniel says, well, God's going to give you the interpretation. And the interpretation is this: your kingdom's over. I'm paraphrasing, but that's what he says. Your kingdom has come to an end. You have been found wanting. You have not done according to God's will, and you are being taken out. That very night, then, is the end of the Babylonian Empire, and the Medo-Persian Empire comes in. And it is Cyrus whose army comes in that night and takes over Babylon. And ultimately, 12 days later, Cyrus himself arrives in Babylon to take his position as ruler of this empire that they have taken over from the Babylonians. As he arrives in Babylon, Daniel is there to meet him, and he gives him a copy of the letter, if you will, this prophecy from Isaiah, stating that he is going to be used of God to rebuild God's temple in Jerusalem. Well, he quickly responds to that in a positive way, and so that Ezra, the first chapter of Ezra, is his decree, the decree of Cyrus to rebuild the temple. And I stress this, that it's about rebuilding the temple, not about rebuilding the city. Remember that prophecy in Daniel was specifically about rebuilding the city. Okay, so now we go to the second possibility, having, I believe, dismissed the first one as not fitting the requirements. The second one is a decree made by Darius, who succeeds Cyrus as king, and he reads the decree of Cyrus and reinforces it and restates it in Ezra chapter 6, and we can read that from verses 3 through 12. But again, this is about rebuilding the temple in Jerusalem and releasing the Jews to do that, but it's not about rebuilding the city specifically. Okay, so then we go to the next chapter of Ezra, chapter 7, and we find the third possibility. It's in the 7th year of King Artaxerxes, who then is a follow-on king of this same era, and he also makes a decree, but his decree, like the first two, like Cyrus and Darius, he makes a decree that's actually about the beautification of the temple. He supplies with that decree the authority to provide silver and gold and timber in order to make the temple as beautiful as it can be. But it doesn't speak specifically about the rebuilding of the city. So again, we just lay that one to one side, and then we come to the one that I believe is specifically the fulfillment of that. And it's in Nehemiah chapter 2, verses 1 through 8. And this is what we read. And it came about in the month Nisan, in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, so it's 13 years after the last decree we discussed, that wine was before him, and I took up the wine. Remember, this is Nehemiah, who is the cupbearer to the king at this point. I took up the wine and gave it to the king. Now I had not been sad in his presence. So the king said to me, "Why is your face sad, though you are not sick? This is nothing but sadness of heart." Then I was very much afraid. I said to the king, "Let the king live forever. Why should my face not be sad when the city, the place of my father's tombs, lies desolate and its gates have been consumed by fire?" Then the king said to me, "What would you request?" So I prayed to the God of heaven. I said to the king, "If it please the king, and if your servant has found favor before you, send me to Judah, to the city of my father's tombs, that I may rebuild it." Then the king said to me, the queen sitting beside him, "How long will your journey be? And when will you return?" So it pleased the king to send me, and I gave him a definite time. And I said to the king, "If it please the king, let letters be given me for the governors of the provinces beyond the river, that they may allow me to pass through until I come to Judah, and a letter to Asaph, the keeper of the king's forest, that he may give me timber to make beams for the gates of the fortress which is by the temple, for the wall of the city, and for the house to which I will go." And the king granted them to me, because the good hand of my God was on me. Understanding that those three previous decrees had brought about, somewhat in a delayed manner, but nonetheless had brought about the rebuilding of the temple. Not to the same level of glory as Solomon's temple, but nonetheless, a temple had been built, but it was sitting in a city that was in ruins. And Nehemiah asked the king to send him to do this. And he's not speaking about the temple, he's now speaking about the city itself. He's talking about building the ramparts and about building the gates specifically. Well, there's something in that. You know, the gates in the context of the scriptures, the gates not only represents the place of entry into a walled city, in and out, but it also represents the seat of government. You see, it was normal that the government of that city, the government of that place, would sit in the gates of the city so that they would control who was able to come in to the city. And so the rebuilding of the gates and the ramparts was not simply about a physical reconstruction of the city, but it was about the reestablishment of the entity of Judah, the entity of the Jewish people being established with its own political leadership. That's what's being restored here, not simply physical gates. That's implied in the building of the gates and the ramparts, is implied that now they are being established as an autonomous group of people once again. So this decree is given. We read at the beginning of chapter 2 of Nehemiah that this takes place in the month of Nisan. That's rather interesting. And in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes. Well, we know from extra-biblical accounts, we know from historical accounts outside of the Bible, we know specifically which years Artaxerxes was king, and which year, therefore, was the 20th year of his reign. And we depend on the writings of Herodotus, and Thucydides. I don't know if that's how you pronounce his name, but both of these were contemporaries of Artaxerxes. Both of these were well-respected historians and chroniclers. And so they give us, we know the years specifically. And so we know that the 20th year of Artaxerxes was from 445 to 444 BC. That was his 20th year on the throne. And so I will say one more thing, and we know this takes place in the month of Nisan. I will say one more thing, and it was normal. It was the pattern of the day for royal decrees to be made on the first day of the month. And so on that basis, we begin the countdown of this prophecy on the first day of Nisan, 445 BC. And so where does that lead us to? And I want to go into a little bit of detail here because I want you to see how carefully God has indicated this. So if that begins 69 weeks, or 7 weeks and 62 weeks, which is 69 weeks, each of the weeks, the word week in Hebrew is almost identical and has the same word root as 7. Shavua is a week and Sheva is the number 7. And so they're almost synonymous with one another. So 69 sevens or 69 weeks, and that equals 483. So 69 times 7 is 483 days. That is the prophetic length of this time period. Each of those days representing a year. Well, you might say, how can you make a day represent a year? Well, I can tell you that there is biblical precedent for it. If you remember in Numbers 14, when the spies went into the land to spy out the land, they were in the land for 40 days. They came back and they gave an evil report, with the exception of course, of Joshua and Caleb, but the other 10 spies gave an evil report. And it was that evil report which was embraced by the people, and God spoke to them and said through Moses, and said, for the 40 days that you were in the land, spying out the land, because you came back and brought back an evil report, you will spend 40 years in the wilderness. A year in the wilderness for each day that you were spying out the land. And in fact, not only does that happen, but that entire generation, those who are 20 years and older, that entire generation dies in the wilderness, including Moses and Aaron, that don't get into the promised land. The only 2 people of that entire generation that make it into the promised land are Joshua and Caleb. Those 2 spies that brought back the report of the Lord saying, doesn't matter that they are giants, God will give us victory because God's told us to come and take this land. That was their testimony, and those were the only 2 allowed to go into the promised land. So that connection of days, 40 days of spying, 40 years in the wilderness. And there are more. In Ezekiel chapter 4, for example, Ezekiel is told to lay on his side for a certain number of days, each day representing a year that Israel has operated in sin. So each day representing a year. So there's a pattern there in Scripture. But I want to get to something that is perhaps a little more controversial, and that is exactly how do you define a year prophetically. In Genesis 7, verse 11, we see that in the events of of Noah's flood, we see in the 17th day of the 2nd month. And then in Genesis 8, verse 4, exactly 150 days later, which is also recorded in Genesis 7, verse 24. So 150 days later, it's the 17th day of the 7th month, which means that exactly 5 months have passed. If 5 months have passed, each month is 30 days long. Okay, that's just simple math. But if we go further, are there some other evidences of this pattern of a 30-day month? I know we've already talked about months and the lunar cycle, but I'm talking now about prophetic years as how they are applied in Scripture. In Revelation 12 and verse 6, we read that the woman who is being pursued is safe for 1,260 days. And in verse 14 of the same chapter, that same time period is referred to as time, times, and half a time, which means 3.5 years, a year, 2 years, and half a year, 3.5 years. So 3.5 years is the same as 1,260 days. We can go a step further than that, which means 3.5 years of 12 months per year of 30 days per month. That's how the math works out. I'll give you one more example in Revelation 13 and verse 5, describing the period of time. Actually, all of these describe the same period of time when it's the second half of the last week, the 70th week of Daniel. There's 3.5 years. It's the second half of it. In Revelation 13:5, it's described as 42 months that the beast will speak blasphemies. I believe, and feel free, please, to go do your homework. Go check this out and see if you can prove me right or wrong, but go look for yourselves. Don't take my word for it. But in Daniel 7 verse 25, it's also describing a period when the beast is speaking blasphemies. And there that same phrase is used, time, times, and half a time, meaning 3.5 years. So 3.5 years is the same as 42 months, is the same as 1,260 days, or 1,260 days. Which means that a prophetic year is 360 days. Interestingly, at the time that Daniel was in Babylon and brought forth this prophecy, was given this prophetic word, that's how the Babylonians observed the year as a 360-day year. That was the way they handled the calendar in Babylon at that time. That was to change, I believe, shortly after Daniel's life, or right at the very end of Daniel's life. There was a discovery made. I'm not going to go there now. I think I've already talked about it. So if a prophetic year is 360 days, then we have, remember, the 69 weeks, which is 483 days, multiply, or 483 days, or 483 years multiplied by 360 days gives us a grand total of 173,880 days. That's the period of time from the beginning to the end of this prophecy, from the time that the decree is made until the time of the ending of sacrifice, the fulfillment of this prophecy. And so we know that the first of Nisan of 445, if you count from that day of 445 BC, the end of that, 173,880 days later, is the 10th of Nisan, AD 32. And the 10th of Nisan, AD 32, is the 10th of the month, the 10th of the first month of the year. This is the day that the Passover lamb is to be separated. This is the day, we call it the triumphal entry. It's also referred to as Palm Sunday. This is the day when Jesus comes from the Mount of Olives into Jerusalem, and it is declared over him that he's identified as the King of the Jews, fulfilling prophecy. He is declared the Son of David, which is also a fulfillment of God's prophetic word. In fact, God's covenant promise to David is being fulfilled here as well. He's the son of David, and he's also being identified specifically as the Passover lamb. I know we've already talked about those things, but this is the day. From that decree, 445 BC by King Artaxerxes, until the 10th of Nisan, the day that Jesus is being set apart as the Passover lamb, the day that Jesus is identified as the King of the Jews and the Son of David. There is such a consistency in God's word. I just wanted to present that to you. We're going to dig a little bit more into Passover before we move on to the other biblical feasts. Stay tuned for more.